just to test some initial knowledge for you. So, poll one. Must a buyer disclose to the seller that their offer is contingent upon selling another property? Yes or no? If so, must an AAR BCA, is the acronym for Buyer Contingency Addendum, be used for that purpose? Yes or no? And finally, true or false? There are times where you would complete both sections 1 and 2 of the Buyer Contingency Addendum. True or false? Ten seconds. All right, let's see what we got. Must a buyer disclose to the seller that their offer is contingent upon selling another property? Absolutely. If it is in fact contingent, now if they are able, they want to sell, but they don't have to sell, they have another means, then that disclosure wouldn't necessarily be required. But if it is a requirement, if they cannot buy this property, if they haven't sold the other one, then yes, that must be disclosed. If so, must an AAR buyer contingency addendum be used for that purpose? That is actually no. Aside from the fact that if you are not a Realtor member, you wouldn't even have access to that buyer contingency addendum. You would have to disclose that in the non-member version of the purchase contract. As you will discover today, there might be other ways that this could be done, and I'll warn you about one of them just to keep an eye specifically on that pre-qualification form. True or false, there are times where you would complete both sections 1 and 2 of the BCA. No, that is false. When we go through those today, it's one or the other. Your contingent property is either under contract or it is not. So you wouldn't utilize both sections of that. So right on the first portion here, so buyer contingency addendum, of course, make sure you're always using the most updated version of the form. This one is from July of 2023. It hasn't been improved at all since then. I kind of say tongue in cheek that I hate this form. As we go through this, you'll start to discover why. I will also say that despite my personal distaste for it, I don't know how to make it better, if that makes sense. If I thought I could make it better, I would certainly share those suggestions with AAR and the Risk Management Committee, the Forms Committee. I think they did as best as they possibly could based on the circumstances, because this is a really tricky situation to account for all of the what ifs in a contingency situation. So, buyer contingency addendum, fill in the blanks 1 through 4, seller, buyer, the premises address, and the date. The following additional terms and conditions are hereby included as part of the contract between seller and buyer for the above referenced premises, if marked by an X and initialed by seller and buyer. The terms and conditions of the contract are included herein by reference. So just your standard legal mumbo jumbo. Instructions: if buyer has accepted an offer to purchase buyer's property, mark the box on line 10 and complete only sections 1 and 3. If buyer has not accepted an offer to purchase buyer's property, mark the box on line 18 and complete only sections 2 and 3. So that was one of the poll questions, right? Would you ever fill out sections 1 and 2? And this is why the answer is no. You would only fill out 1 or 2, but in either case, you're filling out section 3. So section 1, this is the easy one. Contingent upon closing of buyer's property. So this means that the contingent property is already under contract and it is just contingent upon that closing. Buyer has accepted an offer to purchase buyer's real property, accepted offer located at, that is an address. I'm not sure why there are some other things put on these lines sometimes, but that is the property address of the contingent property, aka buyer's property. The accepted offer documents described in section 3 are attached here too, which really are just accepted offer documents. So if your contingent property is already under contract and you are submitting this form along with the offer to purchase a property, all of your offer documents from that contract, from that contingent property, need to be included with this offer and sent over to the listing agent and the seller for this property. I do not see that done as often as it should be. This isn't something that they should have to ask for. This is something that should be submitted right up front, because there's a chance that the sellers want to review that offer to make sure that they're okay with what that buyer accepted for their house before they are willing to accept the offer on this house. Buyer's contingency. If the pending sale of buyer's property does not close escrow by whatever date, buyer has 3 days to waive this contingency by written notice to seller in the manner required by the contingency waiver provision, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and the earnest money shall be released to buyer. This section is the cleaner and clearer section of the two, and even with this, a couple of things that irritate me. One, I don't like that we cannot edit that time period on line 14. I don't know why a buyer would need 3 days to determine if they can waive their contingency or not. Because what I think people get confused about is they are under a misassumption that the buyer could use that 3 days to get their home back under contract and then just proceed as if everything is still fine. But they can't. So this timeline is specific to that first contract that the contingent buyer accepted on their home. Are we already confused? So if we can't swap contracts for the contingent property, then why do they need 3 days? They either know if they can move forward without making this contingent, and that is the only choice. It is not, hey, you can fill the void and get another buyer and it will all proceed. That isn't what this option is. It is they can waive their contingency entirely. So why do they need 3 days to do it? So I am not a fan of having that not be editable. I think that that should say 3 days or, and have a line that allows you to change that timeline.
Leah?
The second part of this, so it says that this contract, if that does happen, if their contingent contract falls through, then this contract shall be deemed canceled. Except, let me scoot forward and let's go look at what line 68 says. Line 68 says, hey, if buyer fails to timely deliver any notice required by this addendum, seller may issue a cure notice to buyer as required by section 7A of this contract. And in the event of buyer's breach, seller shall be entitled to the earnest money pursuant to section B of the contract. So this is where things get a little wonky. One, if you look at the cure section of the purchase contract, it doesn't say anything about seller or the other party may issue a cure notice. The contract says shall issue a cure notice. So is the deal canceled, or do we have to submit a cure notice to give them additional time? Now, maybe the caveat is, well, it's only canceled if they tell us it's canceled, but that's not what the language actually says. In essence, it shall be deemed canceled if these things have not occurred because of that or. So they have the 3 days by written notice in the manner required, or the contract shall be deemed canceled. This, again, this is where it's confusing. And the seller may, not shall, issue a cure notice. So, I mean, I guess if we're aware, we could cure them and give them an extra 3 days, but that's not standard for the contract. So ultimately, we have a little wiggle room here where we're not entirely sure. The only thing I could see where that could be potentially beneficial is if we've had a really uncommunicative side. And I hate to use the word punitive, but that's in essence what this would be. We want to punish them for failure to communicate effectively with us on all of this after we have an accepted contract. So we haven't heard anything, but we know their deal fell through. Maybe we know that because their lender told us, not the other agent. They haven't delivered notice as they were supposed to deliver notice. So that's fine. We'll cure them. hoping that they don't respond in 3 days so that we can keep their earnest money. I mean, strategically, that's the only thing I can think of for why we would even have a cure period instead of just leaving it as, no, the deal is canceled and we're all moving on. That's all I've got. I think I see a couple people maybe in the chat. Oh, Tanya, are you trying to ask a question?
I was, and then I was going to raise my hand. Can't find the hand raiser.
Oh, well, I'm glad somebody was able to hear you. I was not. Okay, go ahead.
It was on that previous question or the number 14. As sometimes when you want to change something, we use a separate addendum. Can't that work? Like a plain, regular addendum to the contract.
Yes, but here's the problem. So which one is going to supersede the other? Because this is also an addendum.
Well, I would think the one that's dated after would supersede. The one
But
that
why
you
would that be dated after? Why wouldn't you have modified that at time of acceptance? Exactly. That's really my sentiment for this entire document is a really heavy sigh and a the only so just as you may not be aware, while this is not editable in the traditional sense, there is nothing that prohibits or precludes you from doing strike throughs. Does everybody know what a strike through is, where you literally put lines through parts of a contract? I see this very commonly in commercial. You just put lines through parts of the contract that you don't want to have apply, and then you would have both parties initial by those strike throughs. And this is typically an option available to you within your digital signing software. So you could, in essence, cross that out, either removing that entirely, meaning you have no days, but that's probably not ideal, but maybe changing that to 1 day and just typing above it 1 day. Again, I just don't understand why. Maybe it was for space reasons, because this obviously goes all the way down to the bottom of the second page. Maybe they just can keep adding all of those lines. But there are ways to edit it. I don't know that an addendum would necessarily be the best way unless we very specifically state that that addendum supersedes the terms of the buyer contingency addendum, which could be done. But boy, are we creating a whole bunch of documents in that case.
Leah, I have a question.
Yes.
What if the original offer has an extended closing, like their buyer couldn't perform in time, so they're now a week or two out of closing?
Yeah, so technically the deal is done, right? So hopefully we would know all of that. Well, I mean, maybe it's done. Maybe it's canceled and the buyer is getting their earnest money back. Or maybe the seller is going to issue a cure notice to give them that additional 3 days to perform. This is where things get wonky. Now, ideally, we didn't wait all the way up until that point, right? We knew in advance that there was going to be a delay, and we drafted an addendum to modify the dates on this document as well as the purchase contract and got everybody's buy-in. Otherwise, then they would have to go ahead and cancel. The buyer would have to go ahead and cancel this and then just get their earnest money back.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else on the easy section of this document? All right, moving on to poll 2. True or false? When using the AARBCA, the seller must approve of the offer that the buyer accepts for their contingent property. True or false? The CCBS status should be used in the MLS when an offer has a BCA with Section 2 completed. Ten seconds. All right, let's see what we got. True or false? When using the BCA, the seller must approve of the offer that the buyer accepts for their contingent property. That is true. That is why it's either attached or, as we're about to read, it will need to be attached once received. And true or false, the CCBS status should be used in the MLS when an offer has a BCA with Section 2 completed. That is true, guys. And I think that that is such a little gold mine for people who are utilizing it appropriately. So if I receive it, I would never side note, soapbox. I hate the UCB status. I don't think it serves any purpose to our sellers. Does it potentially serve a purpose to agents because that property will continue to be syndicated and marketed on sites where they may collect additional leads? Yes. However, I am either it goes to CCBS because we can, in essence, swoop out a current buyer who's contingent and bring a new buyer in. And those are the little gold mines that I think agents should be looking for. If you're not already setting your MLS to search for CCBS status, so coming soon active in CCBS, I would, assuming the listing agent understands what they're doing and they handled that correctly, that means that your buyer has a very real opportunity to get that property if they wish to proceed and they're not contingent, because if they're also contingent, then that really doesn't benefit the seller.
Leah?
Yeah.
Doesn't also CCBS under contract with buyers, doesn't that also keep the clock going as
It
opposed
does.
to pending?
Yes, so that's the part of this that the sellers need to be aware of and educated on so that they can make a decision. What I've seen though is people are using the CCBS status where it's contingent upon closing. This is not contingent upon closing. This is contingent upon the buyer getting an accepted offer on their contingent property. And those are two very different things. So I would treat CCBS just like I would treat active listings in essence. So call and verify if you see one, but that is the downside. So exactly, Tanya, that from a seller's perspective, if you do that, then the days on market continue to accumulate. Whereas if you put it into pending status, they will not. All right, the best section. I'm saying this facetiously. Section 2, contingent upon accepted offer for buyer's property. Okay, this means that they are not under contract. They may not even be listed. So ultimately, there is no requirement for that in this form. It just means, hey, we've got to wait until it goes under contract. So this contract is contingent upon buyer accepting an offer to purchase buyer's real property, accepted offer, located at, again, property address, buyer's property no later than, and you're going to give a date. But Leah, what date do I put in there? I'm so glad you asked. You need to use your crystal ball to determine and commit to these sellers how long it will take to go under contract. You have no idea because you're not under contract. You don't have real dates to work with. So what do I most often see? I generally see that people will commit to 30 days. So this date on line 21 is 30 days from the date that you are making the offer. You could make this any amount of time. If we were in a different market and I wanted this to be hyper aggressive, it may only be 5 days. It may be 7 days. If you want to be more appealing, it might be 15 or 21 days. Whatever, in some cases I've seen there are 90 days in there and the sellers in this market were willing to accept that. So it's completely up to your discretion and what the buyer wants to do. Of course, understanding that that is the commitment that you're making. Hey, if we don't have it happen by this date, then if buyer does not accept an offer on buyer's property by the date set forth on line 21, buyer has 3 days. Again, why it's not editable, I don't know. I don't like it. Buyer has 3 days to waive this buyer contingency by written notice in the manner required by the contingency waiver provision, and contract time periods shall commence, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and earnest money shall be released to buyer. Unless, of course, the seller decides to issue a cure notice due to that lack of notice. So again, there are a couple of variations to that, but typically speaking, if this date has passed and the buyer has not waived their contingency, then this deal would be canceled and they would get their earnest money back. Accepted offer for buyer's property. If buyer accepts an offer on buyer's property by the date set forth on line 21, buyer shall deliver the accepted offer documents described in section 3 to seller or seller's review, or for seller's review, within 3 days or blank days of execution of the accepted offer. Does anybody see a problem with that? There might be a big red arrow and a question on the side of the screen that might lead you to what the problem could be. So our contingent buyer has accepted an offer on their home, and we have to provide a copy of that executed document, contract documents, to this seller. So what happens if this seller uses their 3-day review period to cancel the contract? Is the buyer still obligated to sell their contingent home? Yes, they sure are. So unless you have written a provision into the offer or counter offer for the sale of their property that would allow them to get out within 3 days, then they are required to move forward selling their home. And now they do not have a home to buy because this seller has elected to cancel the contract. Katya.
My microphone was not working, but I do have a question going back to line 26, where you were asking what if the seller cancels? In what scenario would you increase or decrease the days instead of 3?
So this one actually has that line for you right there. So you could say 1 day.
Right, but like, would you do it? Is that, I mean,
I'm going to share something with you that Leah would do because I wouldn't use this damn thing at all personally. If I have a buyer who's contingent upon getting an offer on their home, I wouldn't use this document. If I did use this document, I'd have to make a lot of modifications to it. So I will share with all of you after we go through the form itself, the clause that I would simply input into my purchase contract, and I wouldn't use this form at all. And part of that is for this section right here. That's potentially detrimental to my client. So I'm not a fan of that.
interesting. Thank you.
Can anybody think the purpose behind this, right? Why would the seller be able to review the offer that their contingent buyer accepted? Why would we give the seller the opportunity to review that offer? Can anybody think why?
I can only think of one reason, only it's kind of like the multiple offer thing. You have to prove what you're getting. You have to prove that the other person got what you need to make this contract go, but that's all. I mean, that's all it should be used for. Hey, I got a contract on my house. Well, prove that to me. But otherwise, no.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Tina, that I think that there's a validity verification process, but where this really came in is what if that buyer elected to accept an offer on their property, and we had this happen that actually was 5 other contingencies deep. So 5 other homes have to close before this buyer is able to perform and close on this property. Would that be a concern to the seller?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So really that's the reason for it, that ultimately there might be things in there where we see, hold up, you were stupid enough to accept this, but we don't have to accept this. Why in the world would we put ourselves at risk when so many other balls have to fall in place in order to make this happen? So that's really the reason behind it. Unfortunately, that is very rarely the case where I see sellers cancel. Where I see sellers use this to cancel is because strategically they have determined that they don't want to sell or something else has changed. So they are using this as an out, not for any valid reason. And that's kind of the frustrating part. So we discussed this part already, but seller may within 3 days of receipt of the accepted offer documents cancel this contract and the earnest money shall be released to buyer. Again, that's wild to me. So we've given them the opportunity to modify the days on line 26, but why wouldn't we be able to modify the corresponding days on line 28? So if you change 26, you'd also have to figure out a way to change 28. And again, I'm not a fan of just how this was structured. If buyer accepts an offer on buyer's property and fails to deliver the accepted offer documents to seller within the time frame set forth on line 26 through 27, seller may issue a cure notice to buyer as required by Section 7A of this contract, and in the event of buyer's breach, seller shall be entitled to the earnest money pursuant to Section 7B of this contract. So again, they didn't provide them and the deal is canceled and the earnest money shall be released to buyer, or the seller may issue a cure notice and see where it goes. Buyer's contingency. If seller does not cancel this contract within 3 days of receipt, again, so now we have another line to modify if we've modified line 26. 3 days of receipt of the accepted offer documents, this contract shall become contingent upon the closing of the pending sale of buyer's property by such a date. So now we're forecasting not only a date onto line 21, but another date onto line 34. So 21 is we're going to go under contract by, and line 34 is we're going to close by. So again, you do not have this information when you are submitting the offer and these documents. So you're going to have to forecast that out. So we said line 21 is most typically 30 days away. Line 34 is most typically 60 days away. 30 days to go under contract, 30 days to close. Just a reminder, we discussed this before. If you miss some of these dates, okay, do not complete a new buyer contingency addendum. Don't do a whole new buyer contingency addendum. Just use a standard contract addendum to modify some of those. And again, this does not apply to a new buyer. So you can't have your first buyer fall out and still tell the seller, but you agreed that I could sell my property by this date and we would move forward. No, that agreement was specific to that buyer whose offer documents they accepted. So if your buyer falls out and the seller is willing to give you more time, call me. Because if that's the case, in essence, what we're going to have to do is we are going to have to reword terms of the buyer contingency addendum to reset those dates and convert it from a closing back to contingent upon accepted offer for buyer's property. It's too damn early for all this. If the pending sale of buyer's property does not close by this date, buyer has 3 days to waive this contingency by written notice in the manner required by the contingency waiver provision, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and the earnest money shall be released to buyer. Again, another date that is not editable, and I think 3 days is way too long to give the buyer to waive their contingency, but that's just me. Seller's acceptance of backup contract, okay? This is why we use the CCBS status. If seller accepts a subsequent offer, a backup contract, to purchase the premises before buyer has delivered to seller the accepted offer documents, seller may deliver written notice to buyer informing buyer of the backup contract. Upon receipt of seller's notice, buyer shall have 3 days or however many days to waive this buyer contingency by written notice in the manner required by the contingency waiver provision, and contract time periods shall commence, or this contract shall be deemed canceled and the earnest money shall be released to buyer. Again, I would drop that back to 1 day if I'm using this form. They do not need 3 days, and I don't want my backup buyers to be waiting around for an extra 3 days to get our response. You know if you can waive your buyer contingency or not. Okay. This does not allow them 3 days to get their home under contract. That is not what this says. They need to be able to waive their buyer contingency. So at any point before their contingent property goes under contract, the buyer is at risk of the seller giving them notice that they have another buyer and that they have 3 days, or in my preference, 1 day, to waive their contingency, or we are moving forward with that other buyer. So this is a bump out clause, in essence. That is what is going to occur in that situation. Questions?
Not necessarily a question, but I'm so confused.
You're not alone. Between all of these, well, this is 3 days, but maybe it's not 3 days, and maybe you cure, maybe you don't. Maybe it's a cancellation immediately, maybe it's not. We don't know what the hell is going on. And the only reason I think this document has worked is because nobody really knows what it says. So we're all just kind of operating off of an ignorant and perhaps naive illusion that we understand it. But hey, one of the best lines I heard when I was taking my GRI classes 500 years ago was, if you don't know any better and they don't know any better, everybody's happy, just proceed. And I really, I can think of no better way to describe this document. Most buyers and sellers and even the agents have no idea what to do with this other than, okay, they have until this day to make something happen. So I think that the terms of this actually get violated all the time, but everybody's happy and moving forward, so it doesn't make any difference.
Makes sense.
It doesn't. That's the
No, I mean, it makes sense that everybody's happy, nobody understands it,
right.
let's move
It's
forward.
the form that doesn't make sense. Yeah, exactly. Come on, guys, you have to have some questions about this. This is one of the most convoluted documents, and specifically this section that we have in all of our forms.
I feel like it contradicts itself.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm completely wrong, but it just seems like this and that, but, and so many things.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And I don't think that that was the intention. I really think that they were trying to give options and they were trying to stay consistent with how the rest of the contract is addressed and handled. Um, I don't even think I would have utilized references to cure notices in this personally. Maybe that's one change I would have made. I think that that actually makes it even more muddy, especially when it's not a shall, it's a may. I know that they were trying to give opportunities, but honestly, if that's the case, there's a way to do that by just saying, okay, so we'll modify things on an addendum. We didn't need to put all of that verbiage into this. Julia, oh, unmute yourself. I think your microphone is maybe not working. Can anybody hear Julia?
Can't hear Julia.
No. We see you talking and it shows you're unmuted, but we can't hear you, so your mic might be not working.
Okay, now can you
Yay!
question about the 3-day node opportunity? And I'm wondering if some agent told me that we have 3 days if we want to secure a lender or something like that to wipe out the contingency addendum. Could that be possible?
Yes. So that's really, and honestly, I think that's probably why they gave 3 days, is so that the buyer does have that opportunity to consult with a lender or figure out their finances and determine, hey, I can make this happen without selling my home. However, I'm like, why didn't they have that conversation with a potential lender at the onset of this transaction so that they know? And that's why I feel that there are proactive things that could be done so you don't need that full 3 days, because really that 3 days is just throwing everybody else for an unnecessary loop.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree that was the intention. Anybody else? Okay. Moving on to poll 3. Let's see what you got. True or false? A contingent buyer's inspection period starts upon contract acceptance. True, false, or it depends. True or false? If buyer's contingent property contract cancels, they have 3 days to notify the seller. True or false? Ten seconds. All right, let's see what we got. True or false? A contingent buyer's inspection period starts upon contract acceptance. We have a pretty fair split. It depends is the correct answer, but I think many of you just defaulted to that because you're like, oh, well, if that's an option, that must be correct. So who wants to say what it depends on?
I would say it depends on, because I've heard this before, Leah, with you a few years back, where I believe it did start upon acceptance, but unless you put a date stating, no, it starts at this time, which I thought was a good idea. You don't, I mean, you could have an inspection and not have a closing for 2 months, and who knows what could happen. So it would depend on maybe the date that you would put that the inspection starts, that where the contract is actually solidified and everything is going as a normal contract.
Yeah, so I think you hit on things without saying the specifics. So the first thing that this depends on is it contingent upon closing, or is it contingent upon in essence, them receiving and accepting an offer? So is it contingent based on section 1 or section 2? If it's section 1, your inspection period begins right away. If it's section 2, then when your inspection period begins is based on if you check box 63 or 65 on the buyer contingency addendum, which is what we're about to go over right now. So those are the two things that it depends on. What type of contingency and what box did you mark?
And funny, I put yes, and I'm thinking, oh man, this seems like a trick question.
If buyer's contingent property contract cancels, they have 3 days to notify the seller. Yes, that is correct. What happens if they don't do anything within 3 days?
The seller gets the earnest money,
So only if they've done what though?
issued a cure.
Yep. So they have their initial 3 days to notify the seller. Although here's the wild part about this. How would we know if they have a cancellation on their contingent property unless they've told us that they have a cancellation on their contingent property? Like, how would we know if they've told us and notified us within 3 days or not? I don't think we would unless we do have that situation where there's also a lender involved and the lender tattles on them, not intending to. But I will tell you what, that is how we find out more often than not that, yeah, their deal canceled. Because the lender sends out a notice that says, hey, unfortunately, their deal fell out. So that's going to mean XYZ for their loan. So typically, yes, they have 3 days to notify the seller. If they haven't notified the seller within that 3 days, then the seller may issue a cure notice. And if another 3 days passes, then, and the buyer still hasn't delivered notice, at that point, the seller would get the earnest money because at that point, the buyer would be in breach of contract. I don't know that I want to drag this out for 6 days on behalf of my seller unless I was absolutely certain that we weren't even going to get, because all they have to do is send an email that says, yes, our contingent property fell out, and then they're in compliance and they get their earnest money back. I don't know that this is something I would cure for personally. If I found out, I would just call it a day and be done.
I have a thought. So if you asked how would you know? If you're following that property that once they make it active again, you know.
Potentially, assuming A, they've done that,
Yeah.
and B, that it's in Arizona where we can follow it.
Right.
So of course, everything comes from experience, right? So I've seen some wonky things happening with some of these, and absolutely, we have had. I agree, Cheryl, that would be the number one way. If it's in Arizona, and I can honestly, even if it's not, I could follow Zillow and see if something transpires. Oh God, I just used the dreaded Z word with realtors, but you know what I mean. At the end of the day, we might have to rely on them for some other area information, or realtor.com or homes.com. But following those, you could even set yourself up on a tracker, and you could even set yourself up to receive alerts if it's in Arizona. Like you set up a buyer subscription, you could do that for yourself. So it'll send you an alert immediately if there are any changes to the status in that property. So that would probably be a good idea to set those parameters just to keep an eye on things. People are sneaky. All right, so section 3, additional terms and conditions. The following terms apply to either section, okay? 1 or 2, contingent on sale, contingent on accepted offer, agreed to above. Accepted offer documents. Within the time specified in the applicable section above, buyer shall deliver the accepted offer documents to seller, including a copy of all purchase contract documents evidencing the accepted offer for the sale of buyer's property. And, okay, so this already says, hey, you need to send a copy of all purchase contract documents. What are all purchase contract documents? How do you define those? What are those documents?
I think all addendums and proof of funds. Yeah, everything that is pertinent to the sale of that house.
I would agree, Julia. I think it's interesting that they use the word accepted offer documents or purchase contract documents, because I don't know that that's understood exactly what I would be looking for. So I will say I'll give them credit for then providing those lines, that if I want this super clear what my expectations are, the purchase contract, counter offers, any and all addenda, proof of funds or pre-qualification for buyer, like you could put all of those. And if their contingent offer is also contingent, I may want to see all of those documents as well. So that's why I did the all contract documents for the sale of XYZ. So in essence, I want everything related to that other sale in addition to everything related to this sale. So that, again, that could be pretty complicated. But you have the lines to define exactly, bare minimum, purchase contract and counter offers. I don't think any of us would argue that purchase contract documents are certainly purchase contract and counter offers. But anything else that you want, you might want to go ahead and delineate there on those lines.
I think to establish ongoing conversations with the other agent.
Yes.
To, engage cooperation right from the minute the offer is accepted.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And just keeping, even just randomly checking in. If we're not doing that on contingent deals, we absolutely should be just following up on status, not in an annoying, pestery, like, hey, why aren't you doing your job kind of way. But I'd set the expectation up front. Hey, I'm going to let you know now, my sellers want me to reach out to you every Wednesday to find out what the status of the contingent property is. So just be prepared to respond accordingly. I think expectations go a long way. Cancellation of accepted offer for buyer's property. If buyer's accepted offer cancels for any reason, buyer shall deliver notice to seller within 3 days of buyer's receipt of cancellation and provide evidence of cancellation. Notice to seller shall state buyer's election to either 1, immediately cancel this contract and all earnest money shall be released to buyer, or 2, proceed with this contract by waiving this buyer contingency pursuant to the contingency waiver provision, which we're about to read. So again, and this has been reiterated a few times before, but again, we're stuck with that 3 days, which is what I'm just not a fan of. What document should be used to deliver this notice? I'll give you a hint. The word notice is in the name of the form.
Probably
The notice disclosure one.
cancellation notice.
So there's a notice disclosure form. Yep. The notice disclosure form is a one-party notice document. So anytime you see the word deliver notice or deliver written notice anywhere in the contract that does not have its own document already. So the Binzer has its own form, obviously. Your unfulfilled loan contingency, your appraisal contingency, those have their own documents. But all of the other random, hey, deliver notice, that's where that notice disclosure form comes in, because it's not a mutually agreed upon document. It's a single party notice that they're delivering, which is all that this requires. So that would be the document that would be best used. Would we accept an email? We would. At the end of the day, we would. That would serve as notice, and none of us are going to push back. We want to get our listing back on the market. So we would go ahead and proceed in that situation. But the notice disclosure form is the proper document for that. That contingency waiver provision that has been referenced several times now If at any time buyer elects to waive buyer's contingency and proceed with this contract, buyer must provide written documentation from buyer's lender that buyer can close by the close of escrow date without the sale and closing of buyer's property. Or if this is an all cash sale, evidence of buyer's financial ability to close escrow by the COE date without the sale and closing of buyer's property. If buyer elects to waive the buyer's contingency and proceed with this contract, seller and buyer agree that all other contingencies in the contract shall remain. So if they already had a financing contingency, that would stay in place even if they end up waiving the buyer contingency. And this section does apply to both 1 and 2 of this form. So contingent on accepted offer or contingent on closing, this contract or contingency waiver provision exists for both. What if the buyer is able to waive their contingency? Originally on the offer, they were paying cash from the sale of their contingent property, but now they would need a loan in order to proceed. Does that require seller approval?
Yes.
Maybe. Can they still close on time? Oh, so there's a little thing in the contract that already exists that say, hey, in essence, any cash buyer could change to a loan at any point. And all they have to do is notify, give single party notice to the seller, assuming that that change does not adversely affect the seller, meaning it doesn't increase the seller's costs and it doesn't change the close of escrow date. So you could have a cash buyer elect to proceed with that at any point, and there is nothing you can do about it. They are welcome to get financing. Here is the problem I have always had with this. So we want to make this part super clear so that they understand. They are welcome to change to a loan from cash. However, we will not sign an addendum to that effect. So if you get an addendum, don't sign it, because the second you accept financing, what happens? They get a financing contingency and an appraisal contingency. I don't want this buyer to have a financing and appraisal contingency, so I don't want my seller to sign that addendum to give that to them. As far as we're concerned, we don't care how you pay for this property so long as it closes at the end of the day. But we're not going to allow you to modify the contract to create
I'm sorry, Leah, which line are we on?
So right now we're actually talking about specifically just changing the contract.
Okay, so we're still like on basically 61, still talking about that.
Yep. So we haven't even gotten to the contract time periods. We're talking about if they changed. So if during their contingency waiver provision, if they were previously an all cash sale, but now they want to change over to conventional financing, did they need an addendum to do so?
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And the answer from our perspective is no, and we probably don't want them to have an addendum for that purpose.
So Leah, following up to my question, because I think the reason I said yes, I mean, I know that if they can close on time, it would just be a notice of disclosure for this one change, but that's what I was thinking was, well, then they could have an appraisal and that could maybe mess everything up. But like you were saying, don't sign if they send the addendum over, right? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, exactly. So you're 100% correct, Heather, because that's the concern, right? That obviously this could adversely affect my seller because now it is subject to an appraisal that may or may not come in at contract price. But if we don't sign an addendum that allows them to change to financing, then they're still obligated to pay cash. If they can't get a loan, they would still be obligated to pay cash in that situation.
Because then even, for example, if they just send the notice of disclosure, as you were mentioning before, that's a one-way signature. The seller would never sign that. So we're just saying, sure, go get a loan, but we're not going to maybe agree if it doesn't appraise.
Yeah, and I would assume on their, exactly, and I would assume on that notice disclosure, all they're saying is, hey, we're electing to proceed and waive our contingency. That's really all that disclosure should be saying. But then they would also have to provide, they can send us an LSU and they can send us a prequal. That's fine, great. But again, yeah, we're not going to give you outs on those contingencies when the time comes, if necessary. Katya.
So to piggyback on that, let's say that you give the notice of disclosure that you're changing to conventional. And like said before, it's only signed by one party. So if let's say the property doesn't appraise or, whatever, the seller would keep the earnest money because they violated the terms.
Yeah, so not only would the seller keep the earnest money, this is a situation where they would potentially have a claim for real damages against the buyer if they suffered those, meaning that their costs actually exceeded that of the earnest money. So you don't sue buyers for performance, really, you sue them for realized damages. So yeah, I mean, this could open that buyer up to some potential legal liability as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, contract time period. So this was one of the poll questions as well. The date of contract acceptance for purposes of all applicable contract time periods, excluding opening of escrow and deposit of earnest money, okay? Excluding, meaning that the second this offer is accepted, you open escrow and deposit earnest money. The timelines that they're referring to are really your inspection period. Shall be deemed to be, you're only going to check one box. The date that the signed contract and any incorporated counteroffer is delivered to and received by the appropriate broker as indicated in Section 8I of this contract. Okay, it's your contract acceptance date. The second everybody signs and you're now accepted, that's when your inspection period begins. So that's like the typical contract. Assuming this document wasn't even here, your inspection period starts right away. The other option, 3 days after seller's receipt of buyer's accepted offer documents, provided that seller does not cancel this contract prior to expiration of the 3-day period pursuant to Section 2, lines 28 through 29, or the date that the buyer waives this buyer contingency pursuant to Section 2, lines 22 through 23, or 40 to 41. All that saying, realistically, let's rule Section 1 out entirely. If they have accepted a contract with Section 1 filled out, then your inspection period starts immediately. I don't even know why this section is in here for both because that wouldn't apply. It starts immediately. So you can check box 63 or you can leave these blank if you have filled out section 1. Okay? There's no negotiating that. Your inspection period starts upon contract acceptance. However, line 65 is designed for section 2, meaning that the buyer has the choice to either start their inspection period immediately or wait until they get an accepted offer on their home and then proceed with doing their inspections. So this gives them that 3 days that I still hate. 3 days after seller's receipt, just to make things extra exciting. So realistically, it's like they're going to get about a 13-day inspection period. So they send over their accepted offer documents. Seller has 3 days to review and accept those. Then their inspection period will start after that 3-day period has passed, and then they'll get their full 10 days. This is a nightmare to try to keep track of all of these dates and times for that specific purpose. So what I get asked most often is, which is better? Do we start inspections immediately if they aren't under contract on their contingent property, or do we wait and start inspections after they get an offer? What do you think and why? What is the better option?
Afterwards, because if you start the inspection period right away and your home doesn't sell, then the buyer is ultimately responsible for the inspection fees and everything else. So they're at a loss.
Yeah, no, that's typically the most common response, that ultimately, why should they put the money forth if it's not even going to turn into anything? And another one is, depending on the length of the contingency, other things could happen to that house in the meantime, where doing the inspection later may make more sense, because if anything has happened, then that would be caught during the inspection where it wouldn't have been an issue prior to that. So that's an argument for waiting. What's an argument for doing it right away?
I guess your confidence level, the buyer's confidence level of the purchase, like say if their property doesn't sell, they could buy it cash. They love it so much, they're waiving the inspection. They don't care if something comes up of it anyway.
I think that's part of it. Yeah, Judy, did you have something too? Oh,
Well, I think it would be
that would
better
be,
for the
oh,
seller.
yeah.
I think it'd be better for the seller because the seller doesn't care if the buyer has to pay for inspections. That's, that's what they agree to do. That's on them. The seller would like to know what's wrong with his house and whether they're going to move forward if they get a contract or if they already have a contract on their house. It just makes, and you represent the seller.
Yeah, potentially. So that I think that's a great point. One, who do you represent? Because if I were the seller, I absolutely want them to do their inspection period right away for a couple of reasons. But if they're going to cancel based on inspections, why would I keep my house off the market for 1 or 2 months for them during their contingency period, only to have them cancel on that? But on the flip side, even for the buyer side, guys, yes, I understand they got to fork out 350 or 400 bucks. However, what if they do find something that's a deal breaker? Wouldn't it be better to find that now and cancel now instead of having their own home on the market for God knows how long, going under contract and now being obligated to proceed with that buyer only to have this deal fall apart? So I don't think there is a better necessarily. I think it's going to be case specific to the clients. But to Judy's point, if I have the seller, absolutely, I'd be countering back. They're going to do those inspections right away. I'm not going to risk having my home off the market that long only to have this deal blow up during the inspection period. Failure to deliver notice. Okay, we covered this one already. The whole may issue a cure notice, may not, whatever. Status update. Upon written request, buyer shall provide seller with a written update regarding the status of the accepted offer for the sale of buyer's property. And then the undersigned agrees to the modified or additional terms and conditions contained herein and acknowledges a copy hereof. So this status update, very similarly to an LSU, that is a curable offense. So if you have requested an update regarding the status and you are not receiving it from their agent, you can cure them for that. So just a heads up, because I often hear, well, we're not hearing anything, we don't know what's going on. Cure them for it, because they already agreed that they would provide you with those status updates. All right, before I share my clause with you and the reason for my clause, any questions about section 3?
I have one, Leah.
Yeah.
Okay, so 46, because you were saying, you'd obviously want to see all the contract documents for their contingency, prior. What if they don't put that on A through F? Can you request them to put that on the line, or can you counter back and say, we want F to say we want to see the contingency docs for the buyers?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially it's much easier to do if they're already under contract, right? Because then we know exactly what documents they're going to be sending, because if they did this correctly, they sent them with the offer. But in forecasting for what might happen in the future, yeah, I would go ahead and I would indicate all of those documents on a counteroffer that we will want to see if they didn't fill those out already.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else on this one? Okay, so this has been received kind of with love, kind of with and it depends on who you are and what your broker allows. So early on, as I had mentioned, I don't like the buyer contingency addendum. I am totally fine with section 1. I think section 1 is fine to use. It's very clear cut. It doesn't have a whole bunch of nuance in it. But even then, I'm like, it's okay. What I have recommended to my agents who represent buyers is don't give the seller more power than they should get. And I say that meaning our contract is very buyer friendly, and the buyer has a lot of options and outs within it. And the craziest part about the buyer contingency addendum is it almost flips the script entirely. And I think that's what throws so many of us for a loop, because we're just not used to that. That all of a sudden the seller has power that they wouldn't have otherwise had in different parts of our contract. So to make this a little more clear, what I have suggested is not using the buyer contingency addendum when it's contingent upon an accepted offer. Again, this is only related to section 2. And instead, putting a clause into the additional terms of the purchase contract itself. And that clause is, this contract is contingent upon closing of buyer's property located at this address. If the sale does not close escrow by this date, buyer has 3 days, or I got rid of their nonsense, however many days, to waive this contingency by providing written notice to seller, which shall include evidence of ability to obtain financing or pay cash and close escrow by the close of escrow date, or buyer shall provide written notice to seller that buyer elects to cancel this contract and all earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. So it's all very similar language, right? We're not changing things too drastically. If buyer fails to deliver timely notice, seller shall issue a cure notice to buyer as required by Section 7A of this contract. And in the event of buyer's breach, seller shall be entitled to the earnest money pursuant to Section 7B of this contract. This is where you can modify things a little bit, okay? Because you are copying and pasting this into the additional terms, you don't even have to do the has 3 days or however many days. You could just type in there, has 1 day to waive this contingency. You don't have to use a cure notice portion of this. You could just delete that entire sentence. The deal shall be canceled, period. We're not even going to create those extra days by using a cure notice. So you don't have to have that sentence in this clause. That's what I like. It's more modifiable. Upon request, buyer shall provide seller with a written update regarding the status of the sale of buyer's property. Here is why I used this clause. So it's almost identical to Section 1, except it has the additional part about waiving and the cure notice if you want that, etc. The reason for this is this way the seller does not have that bump out clause available to them. Meaning, seller, if you are going to allow my buyer the opportunity to buy your home, we're going to work off of these dates, period. This also doesn't require seller approval of any accepted offer documents. So those of you representing sellers in this equation, I understand why you might want to utilize that BCA. However, I think that this is so much more clear for both parties. Here's what both parties are committing to. We will sell a property by this date. And if not, then we either cancel and get our earnest money back or the deal is canceled. That is so much simpler than trying to understand all of those weird terms within Section 2 of the Buyer Contingency Addendum. This also does not have an option for a delayed inspection period. There's nothing in here about starting after receipt of their accepted offer documents. This is all, the buyer will start their inspection period immediately upon contract acceptance. So that's kind of the trade-off. So you're giving both a little leeway, but also taking some things away that might be in the BCA. But overall, I just think it's making it far more clear. Okay, we don't care who you sell your home to. So ultimately, if you fall out of contract once, but you can get another buyer right away, doesn't matter to us as long as you close escrow by this date. That is the only thing you're beholden to. And you have to notify us if that doesn't occur. Questions, concerns?
I can see the other realtor saying, oh no, my broker says I have to have a buyer contingency, so get it done and get it to me.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Julia. You absolutely might bump into that. I will tell you we're batting about 50-50 on this right now. 50% that the broker reviews this or the agent reviews it with their broker and they're like, okay, we can see the benefit to this. In some cases, the broker has reached out to me about why I did this. I explained it and they're like, oh, damn. Okay, we kind of understand why maybe we'd all want to use this as opposed to the more complicated document. And some have their little checks and balances sheet and they're like, no, we need the buyer contingency addendum. The funny thing to me is they often say the buyer contingency addendum is required. And like we discussed within that first poll, it's not. So a word of warning that I had mentioned before, disclosure could be as simple as that box checked on the buyer's pre-qualification form that says this sale is contingent upon them selling another property. So I hope all of you are keeping an extra close eye on those pre-qual forms when you're getting them, because there is a possibility that that buyer and agent did not acknowledge or indicate anywhere else that there is a contingency. And you probably want to ask questions if you see that.
Leah, if you're representing the seller and let's say it's a contingency, so obviously they provide the BCA can you counter with this, like an addendum with these terms?
Sure. If I have the seller, quite frankly, I don't know that I would counter the BCA. This,
Okay.
while yes, I think that it is potentially beneficial to both parties, it is definitely more beneficial to the buyer. It gives them a lot more leeway with how they can handle their contingency. And yes, it's less complicated. But that BCA definitely gives our seller some other avenues that they wouldn't have with this clause.
Got it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
so that's a great question. Anybody else? All right. Well, like I said, I will share a copy of this with you. You will have the recording. You'll have the slides. And I will go ahead and share for those of you who don't have it, my entire link to my YouTube channel, because I do have other forms, several other forms on WTF classes recorded as well. So if you really just love the sound of my nasally voice and want to listen to it for hours on end, it is available to you. If you do have any questions after thinking all of this through, I know it's a lot to sort through at 9 o'clock in the morning. Just reach out and let me know. But that's it. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Leah.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Leah.
Bye, thank
you.
you.
Have a good one.